Okay. There we go. So this is a presentation I've given before, but it's the speaking points that I want to touch on. Let's see, here we go. And it was called We Are All Librarians, obviously because I come from the library space. And the most interesting thing, the one thing that is true is I really do believe that we all have the capacity to learn and to capture and to participate in these knowledge management activities. And so it's more broadly like the question of, do you organize? I mean, every one of us within an organization organize in some form or fashion. And most of us research. These are the core components of knowledge management. Research is a fundamental component of knowledge management because you're having to do a lot of discovery and understand your organization, but also understand the outer world. You know, how does internal knowledge align with the outer open world, and really understanding the semantics as well. The other question is, do you educate? Because as we spoke about, this is a core facet or feature of building semantic systems within organizations, is we all become educators. And you know, Joaquin's pretty familiar with this for me, is that I really do believe that to be a good teacher, you also have to be a good student and vice versa. And that it's a reciprocal relationship. So education becomes a core component of, I think, of everyone's role, no matter who you are. And do you track provenance? I mean, this is something that's really important, is understanding like who owns what, where the data comes from, how it's structured, and what it means. And so provenance, you know, is core to how we really organize and understand knowledge management. And finally, information retrieval. So information retrieval is how most of us access information within an ecosystem. And so it becomes fundamental to how we understand knowledge management within organizations. So if you do all of these things, then you are a librarian. And it's really democratizing the idea of those core values of organizing and managing knowledge. It's not something that's just constrained to one person, one role, but it's the core values of knowledge management. So the idea is that we have, you know, because of AI, we're sort of all becoming librarians in this way. We're having to, you know, profile data, assess data, clean, standardize, create data governance frameworks. It's not one role. It's creating an ecosystem. It's creating an entire program around knowledge management and understanding the skill sets that are needed or necessary in order to stand up and to support and scale a knowledge management program. So the idea also has to do with how we model a semantic information system. Most of us are familiar with some sort of format, shape of how we build these systems. And, you know, starting with controlled vocabularies, we have metadata, you know, metadata standards, thesauri, taxonomies, ontologies. And it's not one of these things. It's sort of the concert of all of these things within an ecosystem ultimately. And that is to say that, you know, many organizations will get a lot from just having a controlled vocabulary. It may be flat, it may not be very structured, it may just be an index. But the idea is to disambiguate and have like a controlled set of terms or labels, that vocabulary that helps to disambiguate a space. And then you have reconciliation with thesauri. You have reconciliation of terms between vocabularies, but also capturing of synonyms and antonyms and acronyms and all of those things. And then taxonomy moves into more of a hierarchical rendition of that, and ontology, which is really formal description and logic.
So Jessica, sorry to interrupt you here. So like, I've been to quite a few places and people call ontology one thing and taxonomy another thing and the control vocabulary another thing. So I like your original comment is like, this is this is the common language, and it's very hard also to sell that. You think of taxonomy was this, but now it means this, and it means
Yes.
something else to data people, to people that do governance catalogs.
Yep.
This is great, and but it's like a changer, when you go to a company and tell them this is what we're going to talk about, and these are the standard meanings that we're going to follow.
Right, right. And that again can become very political because people have their own understanding. When you enter a company, there's already culture and there's already a common understanding of what these things are. I actually worked at a company where I was told taxonomy does not exist. It's not a thing. It's a made up thing. So it's picking the battles, but again, it goes back to that component, but some things culturally take time to change. Absolutely. And so this goes through, this is from, this is controlled vocabulary, and it's from NASA's catalog. And I give this view only because it reconciles terms, and it's the glossary or controlled vocabulary view that's derived really from a thesaurus. But it's an example of a controlled vocabulary where you have reconciliation of mission to planet Earth, and it's used for MTPE, the acronym. So there's a common understanding of what these things mean. And so this is perhaps the lowest fidelity semantics that an organization will have. And again, that may be enough for an organization, and that's fine. But iteratively, building on top of that, there's also metadata standards. So these are all of the different ways in which semantics can be presented, but at the same time, all of these things can coexist within a space and can be made to be interoperable and widely understood. Metadata standards, what's interesting is the values, meaning the terms from the controlled vocabulary often will be the values within a metadata standard or metadata system. So there's a relationship between the metadata standards. A database view, for example, if we go back to that sort of Apache Avro view, is you might have something like title and description, which we spoke about earlier. And so having that sort of standardized structural view, or at least a reconciliation of how these records are managed and interoperate, the values come from that common vocabulary. So madmen, excuse me, or that you are able to represent things in a way that help to support findability, which is information retrieval. Taxonomy, which is your hierarchical system. So it's a classification or categorization, parent-child relations. I often go into organizations where you have parent-child, that's it, 1 to 2 levels. But that hierarchical view is the beginning of starting to declare or represent relationships, even though they're somewhat primitive, they're relationships between concepts. So that is an important view. And that can be structured using ontologies. Most organizations that I've worked with love taxonomies. It's something that everyone can use in some form or fashion. Helping people, though, to onboard and understand taxonomies can often, in production, can be a different story. And what I mean by that is taking the leap and being able to represent things in those parent-child relationships, going back to Aura's comment about, the low fidelity, the JSON view of just having those primitive parent-child relationships. That's usually where I see production starting to integrate these sort of taxonomy type structures, and so I do think this is a point where if an organization moves into production in product and structures things as JSON, this is where it's helpful to help with that transition for that onboarding and education.
So Jessica, sorry to bug you. Here's we have just asking about your thinking is you have levels and you have expert level, intermediate level as well in their parentheses, and Adobe Experience Manager, AEM, and you have the AEM following it. Is there a reason you do that? Because we know it's part of that hierarchy.
Yeah, the the level, so expert level. Now, this is an interesting thing because this is very new where I am working right now. And because of how this information is going to be pulled into production, and because of the ambiguity of the marketing branded labels, meaning what we talked about before with the architecture existing in every single product, it was important to contextualize for the glossary view. So that's for the organization. This can be easily stripped when brought into production to be published to a front end. But it helps to disambiguate, and within SCOS, which is a lightweight ontology that structures taxonomies, and according to ONSI Z39.19, which is the guidance for monolingual vocabularies for information retrieval, this is the disambiguation setting that helps to differentiate architecture in the context of AEM versus architecture in the context of Acrobat, Adobe Acrobat. Same label, same word, little different meaning contextually.
It is just sort of the visualization part when we look at the term itself.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And for machines. Because within that, understanding it contextually, if someone brought this into production and completely flattened the structure, which happens, it's not uncommon, we need to maintain that lineage in some form or fashion. And this is a very primitive way to do it, but it does it. It's not my favorite thing to do, but this is part of like, how do we scale up? How do we get people used to these structures? How do we onboard and help people to realize the value that we're driving? So it's something that can be easily understood. And then we have thesaurus, and this is a thesaurus view from a taxonomy that I built. Obviously, this is programming languages. And it's a maturation where there's relationships, although broad relationships, not very specific relationships, but broad relationships. And synonyms are also captured as alt labels. And so this sort of matures the taxonomy and helps to prepare the taxonomy, so to speak, if we were to think of it iteratively. We're starting to mature it into a more sophisticated model so that we're able to support the reconciliation of terminology at scale. And I personally love building thesauruses, thesauri, because when we capture those alt labels or alternative labels, the synonyms, it also helps so much with change management, because you can determine what's the preferred label. What are we going to call this commonly within an ecosystem? And you can also capture other vocabularies, and that's super, super helpful. So an alt label within a governance structure, if we're talking about governance, is that the common label might be application framework. The synonym is application development framework. So we just made another team feel like their vocabulary is still being represented, it's aligned, it's still going to work within an information retrieval system. So synonyms do help to support information retrieval at scale by incorporating alt labels, acronyms, those types of terms. And that helps with building a more robust system. You ate too many synonyms.
Do you have any rules for that? Like, if like in some cases it's simple, other cases, what if there's extra metadata associated so that you cannot use alt labels?
Meaning,
like a start date, end date, this was created by, at some point, if you want to keep that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And that type of data, sometimes it will be connected to a metadata system. So if we were to incorporate that, there's usually an event or history structure depending on what you're using to build your thesaurus. That can be included at least for that governance. So it really depends. That's where we start to get into the nuances of an individual system or an individual ecosystem or a culture. how the data is managed and where it's managed and how it's linked or how it's represented. I've built systems where, in terms of managing those vocabularies, as I mentioned before, there's this internal application, and everyone can view it from a glossary standpoint and see the very primitive relationships, what it's related to, and it's just nice to have so that we can all meet around this common element. And then there's a place where people can propose new terms. They want new terms. And so they click that, it goes into a Slack workflow. And within that Slack workflow, you just say, there's some notice that says 24 hours to respond. And there's either a red X or a green check mark once it's incorporated. And if it's not incorporated and there's a red X, the decision's noted within. It's added as an alt label, for example, please under whatever the term is. So once people get used to that ecosystem and realizing that all vocabularies are somehow incorporated, but this is the preferred term and this is how we're managing the alt labels or other terminology, you start to develop, most of us, a lot of organizations still exist in the space of just having keywords. And that's one of those leaps of faith, is if we think of keywords as alt labels, for example, they can serve similar functions. And so you're grabbing onto the familiar and helping people understand the familiar, relate it to something that's unfamiliar so that they feel confident in understanding this new space or new ecosystem.
Jessica,
yes.
if I can take you one slide back on taxonomy one.
Yes.
Right. So you're coming from like a library domain. So I just want to ask this question. So like when you're building a taxonomy, and as you mentioned here, like it's mostly about the classification and creating a hierarchy. And you mentioned here in the term parent-child or broader, narrower. And the way I've seen it, like in my experience, when you start categorizing and cutting the hierarchy between multiple concepts, you still have there are two ways you can think about that relationship between a parent and child. For example, here the top level, like say levels, and then we have beginners, expert, and intermediate. So for me, I was thinking about levels is a kind of a grouping node on the top, and then we have actual levels values mentioned underneath: beginner, expert, and intermediate. So here is like every single like child node, beginner, expert, and intermediate is all level.
Yes.
Like is a mainly relationship between the parent and the child. When in some other cases, the relationship is kind of a subtype. It's not is but it's a subtype relationship. Maybe you can think about like a vehicle. Vehicle is a top level node. Then you say SUV or like car or like a terrain, or maybe there are different types. Or it's a different like the relationship between parent and child could be different. Have different meanings, right? Something like that. Have you seen those kind of cases when people would like to incorporate these two different meanings of relationship between parent and child within the same taxonomy?
Yeah, and I think that's where there can be different views of the same terms, like to your point of what those relationships are. And because the taxonomy simply is a hierarchy, those types of relationships, while could be modeled differently, it really we can be so anxious at the gate to just leap directly into ontologies. That's where I see that happening, is that people go from 0 to 60 in knowledge management, and they'll model ontologies right away without having the underlying data processed, cleaned, and understood at that sort of primitive and primary view. I see this as you start, it's sort of the progression of life. It's like you start by being an infant, and then you start by lifting your head up, and then you start by crawling, and then crawling becomes wobbling, and wobbling becomes walking, and walking then running. And so I see this as sort of a patient iterative building process. And that this view is if we were to mature that into different types of relationships and expanding that, That would be in the ontology phase. That's when you can break things out of that sort of taxonomy hierarchy view and introduce that complexity. I also see within organizations when people do say that they're applying ontologies, they also fall into the trap of relationships, all the relationships within an ecosystem being is a, has, or type. And I see that as a common pitfall only because if everything's a type and everything has and everything is a, we've just created ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
At scale. So that's why I see this as important, because essentially in a taxonomy, you're just saying you're basically saying has child or has a or narrower term or whatever it is, the way that you model the taxonomy. And then extending that when you get to thesaurus view, it may seem unnecessary, but it actually is a nice baby step towards, okay, now we have related. That's it, related. So you're maturing the relationship instead of just parent-child or alt label or hidden label or those sorts of representations. Now you've just matured it to related or broad relation, those types of things. And then once you have that, then you're working into ontologies. When you are trying to model that type of complexity, what can I say about what are the relationships of these things beyond has a or is a, which technically within ontology land is a thesaurus type view or relationship type. So ontologies where we see, I've been in organizations where ontology actually means taxonomy. There's a lot of different views where we get into the sort of metaphysical, philosophical discussions based on Aristotle, and it's just, what are the relationships amongst these things? What types of relationships do they have? How do I model the simple relations and the complex relations, the event structures, for example, the history. So the history events are very, very important of terminology. When was it deprecated? Understanding and being able to track the lineage of vocabularies and the interconnectedness of things. So, yeah.
It's just separating the model from the instance data.
Yeah.
And that gets, I found in semantics, people get confused with that area. It's easier data modeling because you can separate entities and tables from the actual data that goes into rows, right?
When we're modeling this type of data, it may be, and this is maybe part of the change management portion, is because, and I don't know if anyone else here has seen this or has done this, where we create these sort of ontology-ish type relations that are simply type, these type systems, essentially. And differentiating the types, if you push stakeholders and producers, okay, well, let's define the different types of things. Sometimes that's your inlet, your road, your way of helping to model actual ontologies and understanding the aboutness of things. Yeah.
Words matter.
Words do matter.
Jessica, a question, I'm sorry, about change management and watching this, I think, really wonderful way you take people on a journey, explaining how they're all librarians and everybody can get that. And then you start to march through these steps, and it's all about the relationships, the precision that we're doing, precision of the data and the relationships. And how do you deal with the fact that everybody's now faced with the tidal wave of generative AI, which is not anything that you've talked about here, and that's what people think about and hear about. How do you grapple with that?
With AI in general and structuring, it can be, first of all, that is one of the greatest motivators in why knowledge management, why is this important? is to appease and to appeal to the masses. We can very easily say LLMs crave structure and crave meaning and crave semantics. It helps LLMs and RAG implementations be more performant. So how do we get there? Right? And these are the steps and stages. You know, right now, as we know, knowledge graphs have become very, very popular. And as many years in organizations where I felt like I was a lone voice, just sort of, you know, screaming from the basement, all of a sudden now that knowledge graphs are coming to the forefront with LLMs, it is an opportunity where LLMs are in AI systems and sort of this agentic push, they're not going away. And so that's where we go back to the change management is, okay, if LLMs are not going away and these frameworks, you know, the requirement, knowledge requirement or information and knowledge requirement from LLMs, if that's not going away, then nor should knowledge management. Knowledge management shouldn't go away. Like they need each other to a certain extent. I find them very helpful. You know, I've worked a lot with linked data ecosystems and aligning open world with closed world models. And that's where, you know, I see the greatest leverage point in knowledge management for organizations, because LLMs, for the most part, unless you have your own, you know, if you think of like BERT or some sort of model that's a smaller, medium-sized model that you can build your own, they're trained on the outside world, the outer world, the open world. So that's why it's essentially critical that knowledge management not only exist and be supported within organizations and that everyone participate in that effort now that we're looking at different job roles and skills, but it's also an inflection point that, you know, that our domain language, great. It's awesome that we have our own culture and domain languages but at the same time, we also have to recognize that our customers and the LLMs both understand language and meaning relative to the outside world, the open world. So it's critical that we understand that.
Thank you.
So what's interesting is once you have all these components, because everyone's very excited about knowledge graphs, is that you have iteratively built this really robust, rich knowledge system. You have a knowledge graph once you have all of the components that we just went through. So in some cases, it may be a more simple, less complex knowledge graph, but if you have a triple store, if you have subject, object, predicate type statements, if you have relationships and if you've modeled more complex relationships between things, then you have a knowledge graph. So I think most, because knowledge graphs, back to the point of LLMs, have predominantly emerged now in, you know, as being one of the keys or to unlock success with AI systems. We tend to gravitate to the knowledge graph. And I think we get very excited about the visual presentation without understanding the underlying components. So the visual presentation is a great way to socialize. It is a great way to socialize knowledge management systems, but we shouldn't get stuck in the visual. It's very important because there's a million different ways that you can leverage what's inside the inner workings of a knowledge graph, that you can leverage that through Sparkle or Shackle queries in order to create different views or to serve different business functions. Like that's the really core value. Alignment of vocabularies. It's not so much about the pretty picture, although it helps. It's a great communicator. And people get super excited and they love moving nodes around, you know, anything that's interactive and that you can play with or gamify in some way that people can touch and feel and see. It feels like a huge accomplishment. And it's something that's relatable because, you know, a picture, what is it? communicates or talks, it's 1,000 words. I mean, it's just something that is very easy to understand. So, the idea also, the last part is that I want to cover that's really important is like data quality is inextricable from this process. It's something that we think, okay, we're going to clean it and be done. We're done. And here's our knowledge management system. And it's just expected that we can walk away. And the truth is, and this comes from the library and information space, something that's critical is librarians and library systems have been working with forms of automation and AI since 1963 within digital ecosystems. And that's pretty profound if you think about it from that. In 1963, libraries had already digitized documents and catalog systems and had networked, I think, over 100 libraries between the US and Canada between those systems. So very early on, the library and information science space knew that data cleaning and preparation was fundamental to building and maintaining knowledge management systems. So there's a higher priority or focus on this iterative process of preparing, cleaning, reconciling, merging, ingesting, analyzing, correcting, enriching, reuse, all of those things. So this is like activities that should be constantly going on in the background through workflows, and is absolutely instrumental to building and maintaining and scaling these knowledge management systems.
So Jessica, do you do that data quality work before you load into your triple store, or sometimes in the triple store too?
Sometimes in the triple store, you have to reconcile because there's already terms in there. And when you get a graph at scale, I prefer smaller graphs that can be networked or connected because it helps to manage the knowledge. That's why earlier on when we were talking, I said it's kind of difficult to have one central repository that rules them all, only because also from a management perspective, it becomes very challenging. Very challenging.
Jessica, question about this data quality management, I would say, in the knowledge graph. So there are different, like we talk about different roles, right? There's a ontologist role who is responsible for building the model. There's a tech team which is responsible for managing the actual installation and implementation of a knowledge graph. There are data providers who push the data to the graph. Who, from your understanding and perspective, who is responsible for the validation of the data in the knowledge graph? Is it ontologists? It is the knowledge team which is managing the knowledge graph, data providers, is it all of them? Who is responsible for that?
I don't think it's one person's responsibility. Having a system or a process in place for reconciliation is very helpful. I've seen this done using, if there's a requirement, for example, that everything have linked data. There is a methodology to help to govern that, the change management and the reconciliation process. I've seen it done from transformers. I've seen it, happen from some sort of validation framework using Shackle. So it really depends on the sophistication of the group, right? Of the team and the company itself, the ecosystem of the company as well.
So I'll give you an example from my experience. So there's ontologists who are building the model and who are building the shackle as well. Okay, these are the shackle. We should validate that data against this shackle shape. Fine, they have provided that shackle shape. Knowledge graph team, who is managing the knowledge graph, they say, oh, data is already pushed into the graph. They got the status complete, successful, success. They say, oh, we got this status, we are good. Data provider says, oh, we have pushed the data, it has pushed successfully, we're done. When we run the shackle shapes, there are some there are violations, there are warnings. And I've seen in a scenario that none of this team looked at those violations or warnings. Everybody felt, okay, we have done our task. We have provided the shackle shape. we have pushed the data into the graph, data is there in the graph, whether it's how is the quality, no one looked at the, the output of shackle validation. So
Yeah.
that was the thing I was thinking about, like, is it like all teams should join together and then look at those validations? Is it one of them?
That's an interesting point. And this leads to, because I have been working with the same issue where I am right now, is I want a dashboard. I mean, it's going back to what are your coffee, I mean, like, I feel like you need a talking stick. There has to be, because the complexity of knowledge management, it seems like it should be very simple, but it's not. And so what are the common spaces where we can all align and gather around the fires, you know, and have this visual, have this understanding? You know, we have observability dashboards for other systems. Why wouldn't we be able to pull that shackle query, for example, or validation into something that is visual and tangible? Like
I think there's a little extra step in some cases where you actually have to analyze the data, like for example, algorithmic data, like a credit card number or SIM cards. They have to follow something called a Loon algorithm. So their algorithmic checks, regex checks, which pass the shape. So there's got to be something previous to everything else, and generally the way I've seen it and the way I've done it is we have a team that will do data classification, data profiling, and yeah, there's a team that does, okay, it must fit this form before it goes in past. So there's got to be that monitoring, and the people that do the classification, data quality, and the profiling, they just point out things and give it to the data owners or whoever the manager of that data is, and it's up to them, because if we change it, we become responsible for that.
Well, not to that point, like, then are we looking at multiple stages of validation, which I think is valid, because, for example, the rules of a taxonomy are different than the rules of an ontology per se. So, you know, there's rules in taxonomy and thesauri where you have to apply the disambiguation setting, meaning, like, you know, somehow disambiguate architecture between all the different, you know, if it's repeated 10 times, it's technically the same concept. I build from GUID normally, from identifier, which makes it easier to reconcile terms. So the rules of a taxonomy or thesaurus may be different than the rules of an ontology. Like the interests of those two views and those two functions may be slightly different. So each team has their own role and place within the validation process. I do believe that each and every stage, you know, someone who's building a controlled vocabulary is going to make sure that there's no conflict in terminology and that everything's well defined, right? That's one stage of validation. So to that point, it's cooperative. To Mohammed's point, it's like, how do we give that visual, how do we give that, aside from the teams, how do we help people have visibility into validation and what those qualifications are?
Yeah, I think it takes back to that, as you said, that we need a kind of a dashboard, a visual, because most of the tech folks, they do not have a clear understanding of the shackle, like how the shackle language itself. It's how do you read this, but so maybe a visual helps there in terms of understanding where the problem lies and then figuring it out and fixing it.
Yeah. And, you know, for some, like right now, we have GraphQL, for example. It's not going to give the depth and real understanding, but again, back to the JSON combo is, gosh, if people can start to query, understand the basic shapes, you know, that using a common tool, leveraging a common tool, that's extremely powerful. It may not be perfect by our knowledge management standards, but we're helping people to understand and get there, which is the most important part or piece, the socialization part. Because otherwise, if it's blind trust and faith, and you're just relegating knowledge management into the basement, basically. You don't want it to be in the basement. I sometimes joke that movie, The Office, I don't want to be like the guy with the stapler in the basement. Okay, that's not where I see knowledge management. It's something that we should all touch and feel and own, for sure. This slide I brought up just because it was an early proof in terms of the power of ontologies and interoperability. And it was a linked data project, OCLC, which is the world catalog system that interoperates all of the library catalogs and archives of catalogs throughout the internet. And so there was a 10-year partnership. It was a linked data project. And it basically, through all of these stakeholders, created interoperability between the different catalogs using what I spoke about before, which was the value vocabulary. How do we support that interoperability? There's a value vocabulary with value spaces. It's a very sort of primitive type strata or vertical ontology that allows that networking of the different systems. And it was, I do encourage everyone to look this up or, find out more about this linked data project, because it's pretty profound. The end product, it was very, very successful and created this beautiful linked data ecosystem. And so therefore, a lot of library systems and catalogs are now moving towards just simply entity management and resolution. It's interesting to look over into the library and information space, because they're moving away from simple cataloging into, they actually have a product now within the cataloging systems, worldwide cataloging systems, that in fact are simply entity management and entity resolution systems. So they're partially automating the cataloging process by using linked data, because not only that, it's using this sort of interoperable architecture and leveraging ontologies and linked data at scale, because it helps with concept discovery. It helps with that validation, again, entity resolution and management. What's the same, what's different? And it's now becomes a standard within and within collaborations, for example, between Wikidata and VIAF, all of these sort of linked data authority source type systems to support knowledge at scale.
If I could just mention the work we're doing at Morgan Stanley with OpenAI, is the quality of the answers we get back from OpenAI depends heavily on how many entities we've recognized in the question before we give the question to OpenAI, which is a corollary, I think, to an observation we all make, which is a large vocabulary is an indicator of intelligence. So the more entities we can identify reliably, the smarter our systems will be. So I think that's a very important point. It's both recognize, the task of recognizing entities is a difficult software task, but it depends on knowing what's an entity, having the data, knowing that plan is a ticker symbol for a company as well as an ordinary word.
Yeah. It's extremely powerful, and that sort of recognition. I don't know if anyone has played a little bit with the authority source linking you can do it even within a spreadsheet format. It can be very, very powerful for just helping to glean some, it helps to validate for systems, for LLMs. It helps to validate this term exists. And within each of the linked data pages or locations, authority source locations or authority pages, you're gonna have everything represented as a rich ontology structure. So it lends context. And I wish I had time to go into it today, but it helps people. The overarching reason for doing this is it helps. This is one of those efforts that helps to reconcile closed world or domain language with the real world, the outside world, the open world, which is a critical task right now. And so we become less dogmatic. That's what I see sort of evolving, is that we start to open up our common understanding to align with the open world rather than just aligning with our own sort of branding and marketing.
You mentioned about OCLC, and I think they've built the ontology in BibFrame ontology, and I don't know if Rebecca is on the call or not from Semantic Arts. Me and Rebecca, we were part of their project in early phase, like from being a employee at Cornell University. So we were like both
I'd love
working with them.
I would love to talk and learn more about that experience.
Yeah, like we also have another project, like LD4L, Linked Data File Libraries, with Stanford, Harvard, Cornell, other universities are involved.
That is an amazing project. The LD4. Yeah, that project was amazing, and it was part of this that we're looking at on the screen. That was an incredible. I actually interviewed for the Wikimedian in residence in 2018, but it was paying less than $40,000 a year to live in Palo Alto. It wasn't really in the cards, but yeah, I mean, it's an incredible project, and they continue to build upon it.
So shameless plug, Jessica, any educational material or initiatives you're driving?
Yeah, so I'm writing a book, Intentional Arrangement, which is really about this sort of process and how we organize and understand information and knowledge in our world and our lives, not specific to just within technology spaces, but I do also go through the ontology pipeline, which Olson, he helped coin when I presented at Data Day Texas, is that sort of iterative process of building these knowledge management systems. So that's part of it. And so, I love discussing and exchanging ideas with people as well. So any opportunity to do so, I think that's where the magic happens. I think that's one of the most important things in supporting and building knowledge management systems is dialogue and common understandings.
And the podcast as well? I don't know if you want to make...
Yes, so the Knowledge Commons was the Data Commons. And so Andrew Padilla and I are co-hosts. And so we are exploring the world of open data and open knowledge, the Knowledge Commons and the Data Commons, which, we may not understand or realize what goes into all the production and the building and exchanging of information within these common data and information spaces. The Knowledge Commons really encompasses like all of those resources that a lot of us are leveraging on a daily basis. It can go from Wikidata and Wikimedia into government data, environmental science. There's lots of different viewpoints. And I think a lot of us, without that understanding of what we're using, it becomes very difficult to use it well or use it properly as well.
Great. Well, for any further inquiries, you can connect directly with Jessica. She's lovely and open to any kind of discussion. I implore you to go reach out to her for any further dialogues, coffee chats, etc.